Why I report comments on Facebook shamelessly. This is not clickbait. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and a lot of people will be thinking something like the following when they hear that I, a free speech advocate, regularly report people's comments on Facebook and sometimes even on Twitter. Though, of course, I'll never admit to any specific instance of doing this because according to the rules, I can do this anonymously. And I do.
What?
Yes, I know that this would appear hypocritical because ultimately, no, I do not think that people should get their accounts suspended for 30 days for referring to themselves as quote-unquote faggots or quote-unquote trannies, which has happened to myself and numerous people I know on Facebook. So, you are obviously asking yourself, why would I do this to other people hoping to get them in trouble? Well, honestly, that's a really good question. Such a good question that I've never even answered it to myself, even though I have been flagging comments on Facebook for over a year, never having articulated why I felt it was acceptable to do so, and basically never admitted to doing it to anybody until Sister Danger and I got drunk together a few weeks ago and I confessed it to her, kind of guiltily, telling her basically, this doesn't leave this room. However, one thing I've learned about myself over the years is that even if I can't explain my actions at any given time, even to myself, there's usually a semi-decent reason why I do things. Though people who dislike me would obviously want to say that that's just some sort of rationalization that happens after the fact, and sure, maybe they are right and I'm a horrible person. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that I'm not. That being said, I gave it a fair amount of thought over the past few weeks after my confession to Sister Danger, and I realized I could basically tell the tale of how I went from being endlessly frustrated by the flagging of my comments, which put me on numerous 30-day timeouts for such heinous hate speech crimes as using the words crap, hell, and bully, all the way to where we are now, where I have no problem reporting certain types of people, fighting fire with fire, but never admitting to it. Here's the thing. After months or years of it becoming more than apparent that it wasn't any sort of consistent rules that I was actually violating that were getting me in trouble on Facebook, but rather my actual ideas, which were the problem, I realized that Facebook was a flawed platform with an arbitrary system of governance that needs to basically be used against itself so that it is forced to either reform or be burnt to the ground. You see, none of this censorship ever happened to me back when I was an obedient little leftist that didn't really ask too many questions. Now sure, even back then, I would have never claimed in a million years that only white people can be racist or that only men can be sexist because I have actually known a massive amount of racist racial minorities and sexist women, and I refuse to lie, but I still never bothered to question whether things like feminism were forces of good. I always figured that feminism mostly meant well, because I just didn't really know that it didn't. Yes, even back then, when I wasn't questioning things deeply, people were extremely rude to me when I'd say that every skin color can be racist and that we shouldn't pretend like racism doesn't count if it's coming from certain people, and some of these people would even call me a racist just for saying such things, but it was generally just a, "Oh, that Prince, he's a problematic, privileged white male, but we'll unpack him yet," kind of a reaction, and they kept trying to shame me into submission, but they always failed. The naive little leftists thought in their little heads that I hadn't been hearing about feminism since the 1980s, that I hadn't had run-ins with the critical race theory people in the 1990s, and that maybe I wasn't generally more well-versed in at least the rudimentary concepts behind basically every leftist talking point than pretty much everybody that they knew, albeit while I was actually also apathetic to learning a great deal about the details, because every time I learned about the rudimentary concepts, I found them very tedious, so I didn't decide to actually read full books on them. No, I was not interested in reading full texts of critical race theory, and I don't feel bad for that. Still, those people at the time figured that since I had only learned about the general ideas behind feminism, hadn't actually bothered to read the entire books on feminism like The Will to Change by Bell Hooks, and had only actually read some Audre Lorde, but not enough for their liking or whatever, then, according to them, it was simply a matter of me not being indoctrinated yet. And they figured that they could do it in time. So while they certainly tried to make me feel guilty a lot, they didn't really ban or censor me because I wasn't really digging deep to combat the concepts. However, eventually there was a breaking point, which happened when I got into some arguments with feminists online while having some free time on my hands, and I bothered to actually start looking into their sources so that they could tell for sure that I knew what I was talking about. And even though their sources still tended to be things like internet blogs, I was still able to say, yeah, this doesn't make any sense. And here's why. Thus, when it became apparent to them that I had both ingested the type of feminist propaganda they wanted me to digest and demonstrated a firm understanding of the message that they were trying to convey within the propaganda, all the while being completely critical and quite eloquent in pointing out the illogic of it all, if I do say so myself, well, after they handed me a spoonful of poison with a bunch of sugar on top, and I pulled out a chemical testing kit and said, "Nope, sorry, not swallowing, this is definitely poison, and by the way, I'm gonna warn other people about the fact that you just tried to get me to swallow a spoonful of poison with sugar on top," well, when it became clear that I was going to warn people about the poison of feminist ideas, well, they stopped just insulting me, and it got a lot worse. It was at that point where they jumped to a new strategy, which is a fairly consistent strategy employed by the left in the current year. First, they deplatform and or censor you, and then they start lying about you when you can't even defend yourself. Thus, it went from me publicly saying, yeah, I understand how intersectional feminism is supposed to work, but the way you try to implement it is very obviously logically inconsistent, all the way to them banning me from forums and telling everybody that I'm a horrible misogynist that just hates women because reasons. Which, granted, is almost a bit of a trope of a story at this point. I mean, how many times have you heard about people having things like that happen to them on YouTube? And so, it was at that point that I started to really get pissed, because while in retrospect it was a blessing to be banned from the god-awful forums, where I didn't really like much of anybody anyway, it still kind of sucked to be forcibly removed from places where I socialized due to being what I thought was fair, kind, and honest about social dynamics. From there, I began really taking the red pill because ultimately I was banned from some forums, so I had some new time on my hands. And after a while of poking my head around YouTube, I became a bit of a closet MRA after watching a lot of videos from people like the Honey Badgers, Bane666, and people who I don't think actually define as MRAs, like Sargon, Christina Hoff Sommers, and Camille Paglia. And then from there, I started finding feminist pages on Facebook to engage with again, because honestly, I really like engaging with people. It's fun for me. This was all during the 2016 election campaigns, of course, and Facebook was running a really tight ship regarding how much non-Clinton endorsing posts they would allow basically anywhere, but more so, some pretty obvious conspiracies were actually happening on places like the Everyday Feminism Facebook fan page and the Feminist Frequency Facebook fan page. Basically, anybody critical of everyday feminism in any way would immediately be blocked from commenting on their site, and the blog itself lied about things like Bernie Sanders trying to call his supporters a bunch of racists, but it was worse over on Feminist Frequency. Over there was a user that had absolutely nothing but the default silhouette as her photo, and she was named Dawn McKenna. If anybody ever went and argued in the feminist frequency comments on Facebook, you likely remember this user, as I have talked to at least one other person who knows exactly who I was talking about. Basically, she'd sit around seemingly all day picking fights with anybody criticizing feminist frequency, and she wasn't even attempting to be coherent. Seriously, her arguments at least sounded like a mentally ill 14-year-old who thought Anita Sarkeesian was her best friend, but didn't have any other real friends, so she would defend Anita to the death or something. I have no idea what the deal with this user really was, ultimately, and whether or not she was maybe being paid or something, which I wouldn't exclude as a possibility based on how dedicated she was to all of this. More so, it would seem that she was doing something calculated, because despite the fact that her arguments were vicious and relentless and nonsensical, they just made no sense at all, she would also report seemingly everything she possibly could report to Facebook that was coming from Anita's critics. And oddly enough, Facebook always seemed to side with Dawn McKenna. She was the person that reported me and got my account suspended for saying the words crap and hell, which I don't even think are PG-13 swear words these days, so obviously something really strange was going on. I'm obviously not a conspiracy theorist or anything, but if I was, it would almost appear that maybe she was baiting people with nonsensical, hysterical arguing and insults so that she could report them if they reacted in any way. And it almost looked like Facebook was in on it, due to the fact that they green-lighted seemingly every report from this little tattletale cry-bully who couldn't even come up with an anime default photo. It was an extremely frustrating experience, but I was powerless and then locked out of my account. So what could I do? Soon after that, I called an extremely rude feminist a professional feminist bully when she was behaving like a bully, and it seemed like she was a professional feminist. And I did this because she was trying to socially ostracize me from a friend that I had known for about 15 years. And somehow the word bully was considered hate speech on Facebook, and I think I got a week-long ban for that. And that was the breaking point. Something changed in me then, and what I realize now is that it was the following. What I learned was that this was unfair, this whole system of Facebook and hate speech guidelines and stuff. It was all very, very obviously unfair, and it was being weaponized by a very clearly corrupt establishment of multi-billionaires and federal politicians in order to oppress the citizens of their nation. Sure, they claimed to offer free speech on Facebook, but they clearly were capable of taking it away at any moment for any reason, and they absolutely were doing so regularly. And the worst part about all of this was that basically nobody cared. Certainly not the leftists that I was still surrounded by as my primary social circle at the time. No, in 2016, while all of this was really happening, I lost hundreds of friends who said that I must be crazy because feminism is cool, even though they've never studied it, but I must still be wrong about it, even though I have studied it, and they went on to explain that they didn't want to be my friend anymore because you've been, really stressing me out by talking about how Trump is gonna win the election, which is just dumb because everybody knows Hillary has it in the bag. So, bye Felicia, blocked. So what was I supposed to do to get people to pay attention to what I was saying? I was trying to merely warn people that the very freedom of speech we take for granted was being actively and visibly taken away by the very feminists and far leftists that we had grown to trust in my social sphere. I even predicted the election outcome right after Scott Adams did, though hats off to him, as I give him credit where credit is due, in that his ideas were what made me not just suspect that Trump would win, but feel confident that Trump would win. But still, nobody listened to me, even though I was right. And I was endlessly being gagged for being right by the left. Thus, well, I figured if they were going to gag me and tie me up in a shack, I might as well just burn down the whole shack, or something like that. I figured that if these unfair rules existed and people were so incredibly clueless about why we need to be able to freely discuss political and socio-political ideas, then they'll probably only really learn the hard way. And so, after a while, if a person demonstrated to me on social media, especially on Facebook, that they were what some would call a complete SJW cry bully hypocrite that wanted to have their cake and eat it too when it comes to wanting a bunch of hate speech rules and then being allowed to personally violate them without getting in trouble, then I figured I would fight fire with fire. But here's the thing. Not only did I try to report posts that said things like, "kill all white men," which maybe I did, but I honestly don't even remember. But more so, I started hitting them where I figured it would really hurt, because I was trying to provoke an internal reaction inside these people's heads, because they had proven that they wouldn't care about these injustices until they were the victims of them. Thus, when gay guys would insult me or somebody else and say things like, and I quote, "I think you're just a bitter faggot that needs to get with the times and accept that women now have a seat at the table and that they don't have to put up with your casual misogyny, hunty." Well, then I'd report that post. And here's the thing. I wasn't reporting it because I was offended by the usage of the word quote-unquote faggot said by another gay man. No, of course, I obviously wasn't offended in the least. Rather, I was reporting it because I knew I could. I knew it would be flagged and then removed by Facebook, and I knew that eventually, if that happened to that specific guy enough, he'd start to see the point that free speech advocates were making. Even further than that, the extra delicious thing is that I have now learned very thoroughly through trial and error what currently gets you in trouble on Facebook, so I never do those things, and thus can ironically use this unfair system that I oppose to my advantage. I mean, if these people are trying to report me, it hasn't worked in months and months, and yet I report them, and their accounts do actually get suspended. So, maybe we need to change the rules, or maybe we need to drastically basically just get rid of them. I don't know. That's the whole point that I'm trying to bring up here. Here's the thing. One thing that I was always taught by my favorite writing teacher was that it's always far better to show people things than it is to tell people things. So if people were clearly not listening when I would tell them about the importance of free speech, what better way is there to communicate its importance than showing them it by taking theirs away for completely arbitrary reasons, the way mine and so many others had been taken away repeatedly. Thus, eventually, I started doing that to the clueless far leftist authoritarians that almost certainly are okay with rules and even laws against hate speech, and I've done it to them fairly frequently. But again, I'm telling you right now that I'll never admit to a single specific instance of doing it because I don't have to. Because it is within my rights to report these things anonymously, as that is how the system works. However, it should be of note that I can say, in all honesty, that I have never once reported a comment or tweet made by somebody who already believes in free speech, and they believe that the internet needs less restrictions on quote-unquote hate speech. And also, for the record, I've literally never reported a video outside of one of mine which somebody else had uploaded without telling me. So, no, in case anybody is suspecting, I've never reported any of the YouTube psychos like maybe Cognitive Thought who keep getting in trouble on social media, not because he hasn't done some extremely psychotic things to me as an individual that I could easily report him for numerous times, but because he at least is on a similar side of the free speech argument. So I feel no need to try to show him why free speech is a good thing. That all said, I hope this makes sense to people, and I'm amazed that it took me so long to formulate the reasons I have been doing this. Because now that I write this out, it definitely makes a lot of sense to me, but if somebody knew I was doing this about 6 months ago and asked me to explain myself, they'd definitely think that they had a bit of a gotcha moment on me, as I wouldn't have been able to explain myself very well at that time. That's all. And for the record, remember that I'm having a in-person meetup in Seattle on July 5th, which is a Thursday. Send an email to my email if you think that maybe you can make it. Okay,